she learned to keep it weird.
She is currently scooping up a creative writing MA at San Francisco State University.
Her writing explores the singularity and universality of perversions, isolation, and death, but she still has a good time living in the Mission District with her husband Travis and taxidermic alligator Steve.
Oh, Steve. Her story, To Avoid Danger of Suffocation, awaits shameless self-co-publication in this upcoming Velvet Revolution reader, which we are putting together. And my favorite thing about Loria Mendoza is that she's such a good friend. She'll listen at any time, and she's just such a warm person, and I can't imagine my life without her. I can't believe I lived so many years without her in my life.
And my favorite thing is her ass.
We stole everything.
That's right,
My favorite thing about Loria is that she's so damn sexy, and she comes in bringing all the swag. I don't know why they came out that way, but she always takes the time to let us know that she loves us, and to make us feel good and say one nice thing to us every day before Velro and every time we see her. So we love you, Loria. Please welcome to the podium.
Oh, and she's not leaving. Just so you know, we're tying her ankles to Velro next semester, so she will be back even though she's graduated. So please welcome
Loria Mendoza.
Alright, so I'm going to be reading some short stories from a collection of, you guessed it, short stories. It's called Blue Bonnets and Blue Buds, and I'm just going to go for it. Alright, so I'm going to read the first two pieces back to back because they kind of feed into each other. First page is called Atlas, and then you hear me do this. That means I've started the strange one. Okay? Alright. Atlas. The earliest recorded history of the Godfrey family comes from a man named Atlas. Long before the Republic's settlement in what is now the greater Austin area, Atlas, disillusioned and financially bereft from a brief and public excursion into pedophilia, left his home in Pennsylvania Dutch territory for the promise of a swift and stunning death on the southwestern frontier. He followed the coastline, wary of leaving the constancy of water, and described its tracing in his journals. When he reached the Gulf of Mexico, he followed the vein of the Colorado River up into the heart of Texas, where he happened upon a settlement where only 3 of a party of 50 colonists remained. Perhaps it was the touch of God, or their extreme homeliness that had spared the 3 women from the scalping knife, but more likely than not, the Tonkawas knew that leaving 3 widows to fend for themselves in the Texas wilderness was the unkindest cut of all. Although it must have been obvious to the women that Atlas had no ambition but the brute, they vied for his attention over cornbread, hog, and hominy. The bed they gave him was covered in cedar needles, blown in through the cracks in the walls, and at night the cool winds and conifer oil cured him of his desert fever. He bedded all 3 women and left 2 with the pearls of his offspring before his journal abruptly ends. They called the boy the strange one. He was a fatherless heirloom, secretive, angular. The Georgia woman hadn't wanted him. When he was a day old, she thought about smashing his head on a rock, or drowning him in a shallow pool and leaving him for the rainworms. She resented that she needed company. The other 2 women barely spoke to her if they could help it. One of them, the Missouri woman, gave birth to a girl. The 3 of them took up living together away from the Georgia woman in stiff-necked sisterhood. Their slab faces puckered at the strange one and the woman who carried him. The allergy tickled the malice that had infected the Georgia woman's system. She kept the boy, raised him, didn't let him starve. By the time the children were grown, the man who'd given his seed was all but forgotten in their small, broken circle. The offspring had never known their father, and the Georgia woman was glad. There were no questions, no need to tell the stories she wanted to forget, no need to remember the common thread that choked them all together. But the way the strange one watched his half-sister made her mouth sour. She told him to stop, to look away. The strange one would not obey, would not look away. The Georgia woman came to his room on a Sunday night and took an eye with an iron bite. For weeks he lay in the dark, shielding his shredded cornea from the sting of light with the silver husk of Spanish moss. In those dark days he could only think, and he thought about the girl. He summoned her memory, the curves of her shoulders as she knelt in the kitchen cooking lavender and lye. He kept a bar of her soap under his pillow and would often tamp the block into his mouth, letting his lips' skin burn for her. His mother would watch and hiss through the cracks in the door. But the strange one was not afraid. He knew well the small world in which he'd been kept, the empty little houses full of sand and rats, the cemetery by the river where weathered fingers peeled themselves from the dirt to catch flies, the woods that closed in on the 5 of them like a fist. He never wanted to go too far. He needed to be close to her. He'd go far enough to empty himself of the house, making his heart without being known. He didn't want to scare the girl, and his mother was impatient. She would not give the strange one a home to cry in. She would find him, peel him away from the wall, molding from the fog of his breath, and stick him all over with pins, as if trying to tailor the boy. The stinging pricks kept him awake at night. Restless, he moved in ways to separate muscle from memory. He leapt out of bed and window, jumping at the textures in the dark, twisting himself into the fractal branching of trees, crawling flood-like on the ground, following a trail of lavender. He found himself in the girl's house. He curled into her doorway, a golden arch of light pouring from the meiotic keyhole. His eye ticked off the grains in the wood and the contents of her room, an unroped bed, misaligned shoes, a thick slab of oak littered with botany and florid etches in the wood. He fell asleep waiting for an inch of her skin to appear behind the keyhole, barricading the door inside as she dreamed. He talked in his sleep, revealing his intentions to the girl. She lay frozen, her blood clotting in her motionless, hysterical limbs, listening to his voice. This went on for years, or so she felt. One night, the Norwegian woman found the strange one there in the dark. She thought of waking him, of beating him, but she held her breath and left him there. The next day, when the girl came back, arms heavy with lavender and laurel, her door was thinner, the raw pulp of cedar bleeding its scent into her room, her sheets. At first she didn't notice, too tired from the voice that kept her up every night telling her strange stories. But her mother and the Norwegian woman continued to sand the door down, little by little, until the lock no longer latched. "It's what a girl your age must do," her mother told her. "You either marry or die alone. You either marry or the child won't come. You either marry or this was all for nothing." The Norwegian woman explained marriage, and the girl was afraid. The strange one was the only man she'd ever seen, would perhaps ever know, and it would never be any different. Of course she was afraid. That night, for the first time since they helped bring her boy into the world, the Missouri and Norwegian women go to the Georgia woman's house. They tell her of the marriage, and the Georgia woman smiles. "No," she tells them. She says it over and over again, gurgling the word until the two women unbutton themselves of their hate. They hold her down, pry open her mouth, still round with contrary. Poor the lie. Her percolating screams awaken the strange one, and the girl follows the footsteps carrying the voice away. She wonders, is this how it all begins? The strange one waits for his mother's bidding, but the scars now strangling her tongue, bulbous and stone gray, block all the words. A minute later she is sprawled, her neck and shoulders near, but not touching, her limbs spreading before him like white paths that lead to nowhere. The room already feels cooler. He looks to the Missouri woman and thinks about snapping her vertebrae, changes his mind, does nothing. His freedom is humiliating. There is no movement left but the shrinking of skin, its sliding out of place. The women lead the girl away, the steady hum of her sobs coalescing into the tuneless cacophony of cicadas chanting, "Yes, yes, yes." At dawn he awakens at the girl's feet, her door hanging open like a dead eye. He holds out his blood-knitted hands for her to take. He leads her to the river. He shows her the image of her and the image of him reflecting in the water, bleeding together as the water pumps through the river vein. There's lavender pollen on her eyelashes. She blinks, and some of the dust falls onto her cheeks. He kisses them, pollinating his tongue, swallowing his honey-glossed fear. She is crying, practically howling. So that one. It's nice, uplifting little tale. Alright, so I don't know how long was that? Keep going for a little bit. Okay. This next one is another fun little piece. It's called Mama. So, here it goes. The child was born with granny knot femurs fleshy as macaroons. The twisted thigh bones could not carry the weight of torso, head, and arms. Doctors used pitiless words like possibility and experimental. They suggested removing the arms, though there was no guarantee that the child would live, much less walk. Mama was not so cruel. She mothered and waited, wondering what would blossom from her little round sprout. She did not know how the child learned how to walk on her hands or open doors with her feet. But one morning in the girl walked, her legs curling behind her head, drool rolling down one cheek into her pinched eye, calling for her, Mama. Still, they told her the girl would not live long. There would be the inevitable complications, and there were. The child was adventurous, unpredictable, distant. She wanted a name. Mama heard that her lover had left a city woman with a dull boy. His brain couldn't take root with 50 teeth nestled into his palate. And then there was the girl with no nose, no eyes, just a button row of mouths down the center of her oblong head, born dead. And the youngest was a child with moss growing on the north side of its legs. The city woman lived in a tent and charged travelers a nickel to come look at her children, living and pickled. They'd run the father out of town when the word of the monstrosity between his legs spread. But Mama knew better, knew the child was her doing. For when she'd undressed her lover in the light of day and seen that bristled tail lying in the grass, held the weight of those extra bones and marbled lavender flesh, she'd thought it beautiful, an expression of the creative, boundless limits of nature. She wanted to believe in magic. He had told her he had prophet's blood, and then tore into her like a blind rat. The doctors blamed the madness of her imagination. They explained that if a woman sees a bird during conception, the child will be born with weak bones. A dog would produce a hairy face, a weasel a thief. And hadn't she stared, mesmerized by that tail, curling into itself like a pill bug in her hands? And now she had a stub of her own, with 10 fingers and 10 toes that curled into misshapen Cusinos. That one. Fun. Maybe I'm looking for like a happy one. I think this one's kind of happy, but I don't know what that word means anymore. So this is called Eulogy for Nicholas Cheesy.
This is the happy one?
I think it makes me laugh. I don't know. Yeah, that's how you know writers start really doing something great. And they start just losing it, typing away in the middle of the night. I'm so funny. And then you read it to a group of people and they're all just like, that's good. Alright, so eulogy for Nicholas Cheesy. Nicholas Cheesy died early this morning from heart failure, or maybe it was liver or kidney. There will be no autopsy because he's been declared definitely dead. Surviving him is his wife Eloa, who couldn't be happier to finally have the bed all to herself. Mr. Cheesy rarely groomed and had gotten so fat and rigid he could no longer touch his toes. Consequently, his toenails were always too long and cut his wife's calves to ribbons in his sleep. He was a thrasher, a teeth grinder, and a mouth breather, and for these reasons, Mrs. Cheesy really could not be happier to finally be rid of the sad sack. Preceding him to death are his mother and father, sister and brother, and 2 twin boys who hated him desperately, especially in their final moments, when their father's hand slipped off 10 and 2 to take off his belt and ran the car into a tree. Nicholas Cheesy died early this morning, and there is no one to blame, his only regret. Alright, and I think this might be my last piece I'll read today. It is called Catfish. I guess that's what I ended up calling this piece, because it's right there. Where I was supposed to be. And, yeah, woo, definitely. Okay. I'm sitting alone in the Catfish saloon, motion sickness pulling blackened eyes into dizzy hands. The wall is booger smeared, a little blood in one. The place is a dump. We don't belong to each other, but we are trying to make it work, which is more than I can say about most relationships. I drank too much last night, and the Shavas Regal has left me shaking my bruised head, but I remember some things. I was on my back in the middle of 6th Street, thinking I should be seeing stars, but there were just lines, blurring and crossing. I learned how hard a man can hit a woman when he wants to hit her hard. Who was lusting after her, him or me? Who threw the first punch? By noon, I'd heard it both ways. A man they called a kid had stepped in. Get, he said, swinging the door open, talking to Hub. But Hub wasn't looking at the kid, but at me, catching his breath and his knuckles. Then the kid called to me, "Come on, lady, you want to get out of here?" But I didn't. I knew I'd never leave Hub, or never had anyway. Stupid, the kid said before walking out, just stupid. But who's to say what love is? Some kid? For all I know, love is the cyst in my cheekbone throbbing under my fingertips, knowing that was the feeling of 2 people trying to merge their bodies together. Or maybe it's the way Hub wouldn't touch me after he'd hit me, like dropped crystal that doesn't break, and you're afraid to pick it up and find a crack in the glass, so you just let it collect cobwebs on the kitchen floor. Or maybe love is just the dust that gets hiccuped through the cracks of a bone or glass before they break. And now my body works hard to digest my own teeth, and I could just retch my rotten gut into my glass or crown a screaming child. An old woman sits in the corner of the bar with a pushcart of wilting cabbage, the kind you can buy at Chacon and 12th for 49 cents a pound when you can't afford anything else. She cups her thistle chin, the whiskers blinking like dew-dropped cobwebs in the splits of tree bark. I watch as she rubs at the hairs with mushroom flesh hands, blooming with wine-stained seashells, the bruises of longevity. I realize both of us have probably looked better. Thanks, Jeff.